Fire changes Pokémon in ways that aren't always visible at first glance. Early designs gave Charmander a sharper, more dangerous silhouette that was softened before release. Charmeleon hides a flame behavior most players never see, and one fire Pokémon claimed the spotlight before the franchise had a name. These details don't appear during normal play, yet they quietly shaped how fire types are remembered as volatile, emotional, and difficult to control. And before you drift off, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an upload, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Charmander was nearly designed with a spine running down its back, a small ridge of defense that appeared in early concept artwork and lived briefly in the original sprites from Red and Green. The spike was subtle, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it, but it hinted at something more primal than the gentle starter we came to know. Developers removed it before the final release, smoothing Charmander's silhouette into the rounder, softer form that made it approachable and beloved worldwide. That change mattered more than most players realized, because it shifted Charmander from creature to companion, from wild thing to trusted friend. The spine would have made it dangerous, something to tame rather than raise, but without it, Charmander became a symbol of vulnerability and potential growing together. The flame on its tail still told the story that mattered most, the fragile life burning bright, needing protection and care to survive. Every trainer who chose Charmander carried that responsibility, knowing the flame could go out if they failed, and that quiet weight made the bond between them deeper than any stat or move ever could. Charmeleon holds a secret in its Pokédex entries, a detail that often goes unnoticed in the rush toward Charizard's wings and power. When Charmeleon becomes excited, truly caught up in the heat of battle or joy, its flames shift from their usual orange-red glow to a bluish-white brilliance, hotter and more intense than anything it normally produces. That blue flame phenomenon became the foundation for Mega Charizard X, the black-scaled dragon whose entire body radiates with azure fire born from overwhelming energy. The connection runs deeper than design, suggesting that Mega Evolution doesn't create something new, but rather amplifies what already existed hidden inside the Pokémon all along. Charmeleon's blue flames were always there, dormant, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Mega Evolution simply gave them permission to burn without restraint. This detail reframes the entire evolutionary line, showing that power isn't gained through transformation but revealed through it, pulled from depths that were always present but never fully understood. Charmeleon becomes a bridge between potential and realization, the middle stage where hidden strengths first show themselves before the final form gives them wings. Charizard appeared before any other Pokémon in history, not in the games or even in promotional posters, but in the very first Japanese commercial that introduced the world to this new concept of pocket monsters. The camera opened on Charizard's silhouette against flame, wings spread wide, before showing any other creature or explaining what Pokémon even were. That single image set the tone for everything that followed, establishing fire and flight and power as the visual language the series would speak. The anime doubled down on this primacy, placing Charizard front and center in the Japanese opening theme, soaring across the screen before Pikachu or any starter appeared. Western audiences never saw that version, never knew that Charizard claimed the throne before anyone else had a chance, but in Japan, the message was clear from day one. Charizard wasn't just popular by accident or because of Ash's disobedient partner. It was designed to be the face of Pokémon, the creature that represented everything the franchise wanted to be. Its wings carried ambition, its flames burned with possibility, and its roar echoed through every generation that followed. Even now, decades later, Charizard remains the benchmark against which all other Pokémon are measured, Not because it's the strongest, but because it was first, and being first gave it a gravity that nothing else could replicate. Mega Charizard X exists because of overwhelming power, or at least that's what its Pokédex entry claims. The black coloration spreading across its body and the blue flames erupting from its mouth don't come from any stone or external force. They emerge from Charizard's own energy, growing too intense to contain in its original form. The Megastone simply unlocks what was already building inside, pressure rising until it had no choice but to transform or burn out completely. This makes Mega Charizard X fundamentally different from its Y counterpart, which gains strength through refinement and becomes more of what it already was: faster, hotter, more aerodynamic. X becomes something else entirely, trading the familiar orange for midnight black, swapping flying for dragon, embracing a different kind of power that feels darker and more volatile. The blue flames symbolize that shift, fire burning so hot it no longer looks like fire at all, crossing into territory where normal rules of combustion stop applying. In competitive battles, this translated into unpredictability, opponents expecting the standard fire-flying combination suddenly facing a physical dragon attacker with different weaknesses and resistances. Canonically, though, the transformation represents something more personal, a Charizard pushed beyond its limits, discovering strength it never knew it possessed, even if that strength came wrapped in shadows. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the shiny forms of Mega Charizard tell their own story about color and history and the limitations of early technology. Mega Charizard Y retains the purple coloration that defined shiny Charizard in Generation 2, back when the Game Boy Color couldn't properly display the black variant that would become iconic in later games. That purple was never intended as the final design, just the closest approximation the hardware could manage, but it became beloved anyway, nostalgic and strange in equal measure. When Mega Evolution arrived, the designers chose to honor that original shiny by giving it to the Y form, preserving a piece of Pokémon history that might have otherwise been forgotten. Meanwhile, Mega Charizard X finally got the black and red combination that shiny Charizard always deserved, scales dark as coal with crimson accents and those distinctive blue flames cutting through the darkness. The split between the two forms created a timeline in color, Y looking backward to where the series came from, X looking forward to where it was going. Players who remembered purple Charizard from childhood could choose Y and reconnect with that memory, while those who wanted the modernized vision could pick X and claim the future. Both were correct, both mattered, and both proved that sometimes the accidents and limitations of the past deserve to be preserved alongside the intentions and possibilities of the present. Gigantamax Charizard does something almost unthinkable when it uses its signature move, G-Max Wildfire, literally launching its wings at opponents as projectiles of pure flame. The anime showed this in stunning detail, massive wings detaching from Charizard's body and streaking across the battlefield like meteors, leaving trails of fire in their wake before regenerating in bursts of energy. For a brief moment, Charizard becomes wingless, grounded, vulnerable in a way that echoes its very first appearance in Generation 1 when it couldn't learn fly despite clearly having wings. That limitation frustrated players for years, a flying Pokémon that couldn't use the move that defined flying types, but in hindsight, it makes perfect sense. Charizard's wings were never about flight, not primarily. They were about presence, about claiming the sky visually, even if mechanically it stayed earthbound. Gigantamax took that concept to its logical extreme, turning the wings into weapons instead of transportation, prioritizing offense over mobility. The regeneration aspect matters too, suggesting that Dynamax energy doesn't just make Pokémon larger, but fundamentally alters their biology, allowing them to sacrifice and regrow parts of themselves in ways that would be impossible under no normal circumstances. Charizard burning through its own wings to attack feels reckless and desperate, and absolutely in character for a Pokémon that's always burned brighter than it probably should. Vulpix almost had a baby form called Mekon, shown briefly in the 1997 Space World demo of Gold and Silver alongside dozens of other Pokémon that never made it into the final games. Mekon looked like a smaller, softer Vulpix with fewer tails and rounder features, designed to fill the pre-evolution slot that eventually went to different species entirely. The decision to cut it came down to redundancy. Vulpix was already small and cute enough that adding a stage before it felt unnecessary, diluting the simplicity of its two-stage evolution rather than enhancing it. In the context of Generation 2's baby Pokémon push, where Pichu and Cleffa and Igglybuff all arrived to fill gaps no one knew existed, Mekon's absence stands out as restraint. Not every Pokémon needed a smaller version, and Vulpix worked perfectly as a standalone evolutionary line without extra complications. The Space World demo revealed dozens of these lost possibilities, alternate timelines where different choices were made and different Pokémon claimed the spotlight. Mekon exists now only in that demo, a ghost of what could have been, preserved in data files and appreciated by fans who study the series' development history. Its loss didn't diminish Vulpix. If anything, it strengthened the final design by keeping the focus where it belonged, on the six-tailed fox and its nine-tailed evolution, elegant in their simplicity. Ninetales carries the distinction of starring in one of the strangest misprints in trading card game history, a card officially known as No Damage Ninetales, where the attack Fire Blast completely lacks any damage value. The card functions normally in every other way: energy costs correct, text accurate, artwork beautiful, but when Fire Blast resolves, it does exactly what the blank space suggests: nothing at all. Collectors debate whether this was an intentional test print that escaped into circulation or a genuine error that somehow made it through quality control, but either way, the card exists, playable but pointless, a perfect example of form without function. Imagine bringing that card to a tournament and trying to explain that your Ninetales can use Fire Blast, but it won't actually hurt anything, just sits there looking impressive while accomplishing nothing. The philosophical implications are almost profound. A Fire-type Pokémon whose signature move became purely ceremonial, all flash and no substance. In competitive play, it would be the worst card ever printed, completely unusable except as a novelty or collector's item. In the broader context of Pokémon's history, though, it represents something important, the reminder that even in a carefully controlled franchise, mistakes happen, strange artifacts slip through the cracks, and sometimes those accidents become more memorable than things that worked exactly as intended. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at Growlithe and its unexpected connection to Thunderstones, a glitch in Generation 1 where Growlithe's internal hex value matched the Thunderstone's identifier, creating bizarre evolutionary possibilities. If you had Growlithe on the field and switched to Pikachu, then leveled up while Growlithe was still in your party, the game would confuse Growlithe's presence with a Thunderstone and evolve Pikachu into Raichu. The glitch was harmless but surreal, turning a Fire-type puppy into an evolutionary catalyst for electric mice through nothing more than coding overlap. It never affected actual gameplay in meaningful ways, since the conditions required were so specific and accidental, but it revealed the fragile architecture beneath Pokémon's surface, the way everything connected through numbers and identifiers that sometimes collided in unexpected ways. Later games fixed these overlaps, assigning unique values to every item and Pokémon to prevent future confusion, but Generation 1 remains full of these small glitches, each one a window into how the original games were built and how close they came to breaking under their own complexity. Growlithe's Thunderstone impersonation lives on in speedrunning communities and glitch documentation, a footnote in Pokemon history that's more interesting for what it reveals about game design than anything it actually accomplishes. Hisuian Growlithe and Arcanine may have been hinted at long before Legends. Arceus arrived, buried in an Ultramoon Pokédex entry that mentioned Growlithe living alongside humans since ancient times, and bones being found in Stone Age excavations. The emphasis on Stone Age felt deliberate, too specific to be random flavor text, suggesting the developers already knew a rock-type variant existed in the past even if players wouldn't meet it for several more years. When Hisuian Growlithe finally appeared, covered in volcanic rock and resembling ancient statues more than living creatures, the connection became obvious. These weren't new Pokemon, they were old ones, preserved in regional memory and finally brought forward into playable form. The design leaned into geology and archaeology, Growlithe's fur replaced with stone-like ridges, Arcanine's mane transformed into layered rock formations that resembled both flames and mountains. The rock-fire typing made perfect sense for Pokemon that lived near volcanoes and shaped themselves to match their environment. Armor and camouflage combined into one elegant solution. Trainers in ancient Sinnoh would have relied on these Pokemon for warmth and protection, their stone hides deflecting attacks, while their inner fire kept homes and camps safe through brutal winters. The modern variants lost that rock armor over generations, adapting to easier climates where defense mattered less than speed and companionship, but the fossils and bones are remembered, waiting in the ground for someone to notice what had been lost. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off. And tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Emboar stands apart in its evolutionary line as the only one whose body actually carries visible flames, a beard of fire that burns along its jaw and becomes the source of its fighting style. Tepig and Pignite generate heat, but don't manifest it visually. Their fire internal and controlled, but when Emboar evolves, something changes, power rising to the surface and demanding expression through flame. The Pokédex describes how Emboar ignites its fists by touching them to its flaming beard, creating fire punches that combine martial arts with raw heat in a way that feels both primitive and refined. That image, a warrior monk lighting its hands on fire before entering combat, draws directly from Zhu Baji, the pig demon from Journey to the West, who traveled alongside Sun Wukong and served as both comic relief and loyal companion. Emboar inherits that loyalty, entries emphasizing how deeply it cares for friends and allies, willing to throw itself into danger without hesitation if it means protecting those it loves. The Fighting Type Edition represents discipline in training. Fire alone isn't enough. Emboar masters technique and strategy alongside raw power, becoming something more than just a strong Pokemon. In competitive battling, that dual typing became a liability, quadruple weakness to ground attacks, making it fragile despite its bulky appearance. But thematically, it made perfect sense. A warrior who fights with heart and fire, vulnerable but determined, strong not because it can't be hurt, but because it refuses to stop. Magmar and Magmortar occupy a strange space in Fire-type lore, creatures that supposedly live in magma, but exist primarily above ground, creating confusion about their actual habitat and biology. Magma refers specifically to molten rock beneath the Earth's crust, while lava is that same material after it reaches the surface, meaning these Pokemon should technically be Lavamar and Lavamortar if they're ever seen by trainers. The distinction matters less than the image they create, duck-like birds with bodies that shimmer with heat, based partially on mythical Karura from Buddhist mythology, creatures of flame that consumed evil spirits. Game Freak clearly wanted a Pokémon that embodied volcanic heat without being limited to volcano locations, so they fudged the naming and let players interpret the rest. Magmar's design always looked slightly uncomfortable, like its body existed in a state of constant burning that it had learned to endure rather than enjoy. The addition of Magmortar amplified that feeling, turning Magmar into a living artillery piece with cannon arms that launched fireballs instead of creating close-range flames. The evolution suggested that as Magmar grew stronger, it needed better ways to release the heat building inside, bigger outlets to prevent overload. Fire types often deal with this problem, managing internal temperatures that would kill other Pokémon, finding balance between power and self-preservation. Magmortar solved it through weaponization, turning potential weakness into tactical advantage, heat that might consume it from within redirected outwards toward an enemy's instead. As we drift a little deeper into understanding fire's many forms, the Chimchar line presents perhaps the most direct connection to mythology that any starter Pokémon has ever claimed. Chimchar, Monferno, and Infernape draw from Sun Wukong, the Monkey King from Journey to the West, whose story influenced countless other works and established archetypes that persist through modern media. The fire typing comes not just from the flames on their tails and heads, but from Sun Wukong's association with the sun itself, celestial fire brought to Earth through his rebellion and adventures. Infernape specifically mirrors Hanuman from the Ramayana, another divine monkey granted immunity to fire and able to wield it without harm, his body untouchable by flames that would consume anyone else. These mythological connections elevate the evolutionary line beyond simple animal-to-fighter progression, placing them in conversation with stories thousands of years old about heroes who challenged gods and reshaped worlds through determination and strength. The crown of flames circling Infernape's head resembles both a warrior's helmet and a divine halo, physical and spiritual power unified in single image. Trainers who chose Chimchar weren't just picking a fire starter, they were claiming a piece of legend, carrying forward myths that predated Pokémon by centuries and giving them new form in digital space. The connection runs even deeper when you consider that Sun Wukong was punished by being thrown into a furnace for 49 days, emerging with golden eyes that could see through any deception. Infernape's fierce gaze carries that same quality, eyes that have looked into fire and survived, transformed rather than destroyed by heat that should have killed. The fighting type addition makes sense in this context. Sun Wukong was the greatest fighter in heaven and earth, unmatched in combat, able to defeat armies through skill and strategy rather than just raw power. Infernape inherited that legacy, speed and technique defining its battle style more than overwhelming force. In the anime, Ash's Infernape's blaze ability triggered during its most desperate moments, flames exploding across its body when it refused to give up despite injuries and exhaustion. That visual perfectly captured the myth it referenced, power born from perseverance, strength that emerged only when everything else had been burned away. Competitive players recognized Infernape's potential immediately, mixed attacking stats and wide move pool, making it versatile and unpredictable, able to adapt to situations rather than being locked into single strategy. Like its mythological inspiration, Infernape succeeded not by being the strongest, but by being the most clever and most determined, and that made it beloved in ways that pure power never could. Litwick, Lampent, and Chandelure exist outside the normal fire-type color palette, trading reds and oranges for purples and blues that feel ghostly and wrong in the best possible way. The design choice came from their basis in Hitodama, The eastern version of will-o'-the-wisps, ghostly flames that appear in darkness and led travelers either to safety or to doom, depending on the story being told. These spectral fires burn different colors than living flames, blues and purples and greens that signal something unnatural, fire without warmth or life behind it. Chandelure's flame specifically draws power from spirits, the Pokédex describing how it absorbs life energy from those who come too close, using their essence to fuel the flames that hang from its arms like mournful decorations. The entire evolutionary line weaponizes something that should be comforting, light and darkness, and turns it sinister through subtle design choices that make you question whether you want to get closer or run away. In battle, Ghost Fire typing created one of the best offensive combinations in the game, few resistances, and powerful stab moves on both sides, making Chandelure a special attacking threat that could dismantle teams if given the opportunity. But the typing also made it fragile. Weaknesses to dark, ghost, ground, rock, and water attacks, meaning it needed careful positioning and support to survive long enough to do its job. The aesthetic influence of Chandelure extended beyond its own design into how future Ghost Fire Pokémon were conceived, establishing precedent for flames that hurt rather than warm, light that guides only to consume. The purple fire became signature element, recognizable across generations as belonging specifically to ghost types that borrowed fire's form without embracing its nature. Lampent, in particular, embodies transition, not quite candle anymore, but not yet full chandelier, spirit lamp, caught between states and unable to commit to either. Its Pokédex entry mentions how it appears in hospitals and cemeteries, waiting for people to die so it can absorb their departing spirits and grow stronger. That detail transforms Lampent from spooky decoration into active predator, creature that doesn't just use death's imagery, but actively participates in it, waiting patiently for opportunities that inevitably come to everyone eventually. Players tend to overlook this horror in favor of Chandelure's elegant design and competitive viability, but Lampent holds the line's true darkness, the moment when cute, ghostly candle becomes something genuinely threatening. Even its evolution method reinforces this, requiring a duskstone to transform, item associated with twilight and endings, the time when day dies and night claims everything. Fire types usually represent passion and energy and life burning bright, but this line inverts all of that, showing fire after life has left, flames that continue burning only because they're fed by what was lost. Fennekin and its evolutionary line brought a different kind of fire to Kalos, one wrapped in mysticism and psychic energy rather than pure combustion. Braixen and Delphox wield fire like witches and mages, conjuring flames through will and focus rather than letting them erupt naturally from their bodies. The stick that Braixen carries becomes a wand in Delphox's hands, focal point for psychic energy that manifests as fire when directed outward toward opponents or obstacles. This combination of fire and psychic typing created something elegant and strange, Pokémon that thought about fire rather than simply being fire, that shaped flames through intention rather than instinct. The design drew from European witchcraft and fortune-telling traditions, Delphox's robes resembling ceremonial garments worn by mystics and seers. Its ear tufts styled like a witch's hat, its overall silhouette suggesting someone who reads futures in flames and speaks prophecies while burning sage. In French folklore, foxes were associated with trickery and magic, cunning creatures that operated outside normal rules and bent reality to serve their purposes. Delphox inherited that reputation, special attacker, with access to psychic and grass coverage moves alongside its fire stab, able to hit almost anything for at least neutral damage and predict opponent responses through sheer versatility. The starter triangle in Kalos felt more thematically coherent than most generations, Chestnut representing physical might and defense, Greninja embodying speed and precision, Delphox bridging them through special attacks and tactical thinking. Each starter excelled in its own way, but Delphox struggled most in competitive play, typing that gave it 5 weaknesses, including common ones like water, ground, and dark, combined with merely decent speed that left it outsped by faster threats. What saved it from obscurity was versatility. Access to moves like Grass Knot, Psychic, Shadow Ball, and Dazzling Gleam meant it could always hit something for super effective damage, even if it couldn't take hits in return. Thematically, though, Delphox succeeded completely, capturing the image of fire as tool of divination and transformation, flames that revealed truth rather than just destroyed obstacles. Its shiny form turned the red accents white and the yellow flame blue, inverting the color scheme into something even more mystical and otherworldly. Players who appreciated aesthetics over meta viability found Delphox deeply satisfying, a fire type that felt intelligent and deliberate, that seemed to plan 3 moves ahead and manipulate the battlefield through knowledge rather than brute force. In a type defined by passion and chaos, Delphox stood apart as fire-controlled, channeled, made precise through discipline and study. Fletchinder occupies a unique evolutionary niche as a fire-flying bird that emerges from a pure, normal flying pre-evolution transformation triggered not by evolutionary stone or special condition, but simply by reaching level 17. The sudden appearance of fire typing surprised many players who assumed Fletchling would remain a normal bird throughout its line, but the change makes sense when you consider how Fletchinder's design shifts from small songbird to hunting falcon. The red plumage intensifies, the tail feathers ignite, and suddenly, this creature that was pecking at seeds is diving from height, with talons extended and flames trailing behind. Talonflame completed the transformation, speed and power unified into aerial predator that dominated early X and Y competitive play through its Gale Wings ability, which gave flying moves priority and turned Brave Bird into unstoppable opening move. The ability eventually got nerfed, restricted to work only at full health, but for a time, Talonflame defined entire metagame strategies, forcing teams to account for it or get swept in the opening turns. The fire-flying combination has always been rare, despite seeming obvious, only a handful of Pokémon claiming both types simultaneously. Talonflame joined Charizard, Moltres, and Ho-Oh in that exclusive club, bringing with it a different approach to the typing, less about overwhelming power or legendary status, and more about practical hunting efficiency. Real birds of prey use incredible speed to catch food, diving at speeds that would tear apart weaker creatures, and Talonflame mirrors that biology through game mechanics that reward aggressive play and calculated risks. Brave Bird's recoil damage represents the physical toll of such extreme maneuvers, the way high-speed impacts hurt even the attacker, but the move's power justifies the cost, especially when priority meant Talonflame struck first, regardless of speed stats. Even after the nerf, Talonflame remained viable in lower tiers, Flame Body ability punishing physical attackers and maintaining pressure through burns. The entire line teaches an important lesson about fire types. They don't all need to be explosive or dramatic. Sometimes fire manifests as friction and speed, heat generated through motion rather than chemical reaction. Talonflame burns because it moves faster than air wants to allow, and that kind of fire, born from velocity and determination, feels just as valid as any dragon's breath or volcano's eruption. As we drift a little deeper through the varieties of flame, Litten's evolutionary line takes fire-type design in a direction that divided fans from the moment Incineroar's final form leaked before Sun and Moon's release. What began as an adorable kitten with a serious expression evolved through brooding teenager Torracat into full wrestler heel Incineroar, Fire Dark Bruiser that looked less like a Pokémon and more like a character from fighting game, wearing very detailed muscles. The shift from quadrupedal to bipedal bothered players who wanted Litten to stay cat-like, evolving into something sleek and predatory rather than theatrical and humanoid. But Incineroar's design makes perfect sense when you understand it. References heel wrestlers, villains in professional wrestling who play up aggression and arrogance to get crowd reactions. The fire belt wrapped around its waist resembles a championship belt, flames erupting from it during signature moves to add visual drama to attacks that already looked over the top. Darkest Lariat, its signature move, has Incineroar spinning like a top with arms extended, dark energy and fire combining into devastating close-range attack that ignores stat changes and hits for massive damage. The move perfectly captures wrestling's theatrical violence, combat as a performance, every motion exaggerated for maximum impact. Incineroar's personality reinforces this theme. Pokédex entries describing how it shows off to crowds and gets stronger when audiences watch its battles, feeding off attention and using it as motivation to push harder. In the anime, Ash's Incineroar displayed this exact behavior, playing up its tough guy persona while secretly being gentle with weaker Pokémon when no one was looking. That gap between performance and reality defines heel characters. They act ruthless and arrogant, but underneath might be a completely different person playing role for strategic reasons. Competitively, Incineroar became staple of VGC doubles through its Intimidate ability and access to Fake Out, a combination that gave it defensive utility despite its aggressive appearance. Parting Shot allowed it to debuff opponents while switching out safely, and Flare Blitz provided stab damage when pure support wasn't enough. The Fire Dark typing created interesting coverage options, resistant to Psychic and immune to Prankster-boosted status moves, though weak to water, ground, fighting, and rock attacks. Players who initially dismissed Incineroar's design came around after seeing it in action, recognizing that while it might not look like traditional fire type, it embodied fire's chaotic energy through a different lens. Heat channeled into showmanship and intimidation rather than just raw destruction. Turtonator exists because Volcano can be shaped like turtles, or at least that's what the initial design pitch must have sounded like. The Dragonfire Turtle carries an explosive shell that detonates when struck from behind, trap waiting for opponents who try to flank it during battle. The design references both volcanic explosions and naval mines, defensive weapons that punish aggression with catastrophic counterattacks. Its shell trap move embodies this perfectly, setting up during one turn and exploding if hit by a physical attack before the move executes, dealing massive damage to anything that triggered the detonation. The mind game potential made Turtonator interesting in theory, forcing opponents to choose between attacking and risking the trap, or waiting and giving Turtonator free turn to set up again. In practice, the move saw limited use because opponents could simply use special attacks or non-damaging moves to avoid triggering it, but thematically it perfectly captured the Pokémon's entire concept. Turtonator lives at the intersection of patience and violence, waiting for the right moment to unleash everything at once, and that restraint followed by explosion feels very fire-type, despite the dragon primary typing suggesting otherwise. The volcanic turtle concept extends beyond just the shell trap gimmick into Turtonator's entire biology, body temperature high enough to ignite anything that touches it for too long, tail that drips molten sulfur, like dragon's blood made real. Pokédex entries mention how it lives on volcanoes and feeds on sulfur, diet of pure volcanic minerals, creating the explosive gases that power its shell trap and other moves. This makes Turtonator one of the few fire types whose flames come from geological processes rather than biological ones, chemistry of volcanoes made mobile and combative. The dragon typing adds mythological weight, connecting modern fire type to ancient legends of dragons guarding mountains and hoarding treasure in volcanic caves. Turtonator doesn't hoard gold though, it collects heat and sulfur and explosive potential, waiting for threats to arrive so it can demonstrate why approaching was a mistake. In Alola's ecosystem, it serves as natural predator deterrent, too dangerous to attack from behind and too hot to grapple with safely, forcing other Pokémon to either leave it alone or approach very carefully from specific angles. That defensive design philosophy makes it one of the more interesting fire types strategically, creature that wins through positioning and prediction rather than just hitting harder than everything else. Salandit and Salazzle introduced pheromones to fire-type Pokémon, toxic attraction that let female Salazzle control groups of male Salandit through chemical manipulation. The gender-exclusive evolution bothered some players who raised male Salandit, expecting them to evolve normally, only to discover that no amount of leveling would ever trigger transformation. Only females could become Salazzle. Males remained Salandit forever, living in groups controlled by dominant female who used them for protection and resource gathering. The design drew from real lizard behaviors where size and dominance hierarchies determine mating access, but it also tapped into deeper themes about toxic relationships and control through addiction. Salazzle's pheromones created dependency in male Salandit, need that couldn't be fulfilled anywhere else, and that dynamic felt darker than most Pokémon usually ventured. The fire-poison typing reflected this duality. Heat and toxicity combined into something dangerous in ways that pure fire could never be, burning that left lasting harm even after the flames died down. Competitively, Salazzle carved out niche as fast special attacker with corrosion ability that let it poison steel and poison types, normally immune to toxic status. This opened strategies that revolved around spreading poison across entire team and stalling while opponents slowly lost health to residual damage. Nasty Plot boosted its special attack to threatening levels, and coverage moves like Flamethrower, Sludge Wave, and Dragon Pulse gave it ways to hit most Pokémon for at least neutral damage. The design's sultry aesthetic attracted attention and controversy in equal measure, some fans celebrating the confident femme fatale energy, while others felt it pushed too far into uncomfortable territory for children's game. Regardless of personal feelings about the design choices, Salazzle represented important addition to fire-type roster, showing that fire didn't have to be wholesome or heroic or even particularly noble. Sometimes fire poisoned what it touched, and sometimes that poison was the entire point, weapon wielded with precision and cruelty by those who understood how to use attraction as tool of control. In Alola's ecosystem, Salazzle filled role of apex predator in specific environments, too toxic to eat and too dominant to challenge. Perfect example of how fire types could thrive through intimidation rather than direct combat. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at Turtonator's connection to competitive doubles, where its slow speed became advantage rather than liability. Trick Room teams loved Turtonator because in reverse speed conditions, it moved before most opponents, allowing it to set up Shell Trap or fire off devastating eruption attacks while enemies were still planning their responses. Eruption scales with remaining health, dealing maximum damage at full HP and decreasing as Turtonator takes hits, creating a clock that opponents had to respect. Combined with Dragon Tail to force switches and rack up hazard damage, Turtonator became disruptive presence that controlled battlefield tempo through threat of explosion and zone control. The strategy required setup and support. Trick Room Setter needed to survive long enough to activate the field effect, and Turtonator needed protection from super effective hits that would drop its health before Eruption could claim knockouts. But when everything aligned correctly, it felt unstoppable, slow volcanic turtle suddenly becoming faster than everything else, hitting harder with each attack because opponents couldn't reduce its health quickly enough. That reversal of expectations, turning weakness into strength through creative team building, exemplified why Pokemon's competitive scene remained interesting across generations. Any Pokemon could be viable with right support, right conditions, right understanding of how mechanics intersected with design intent. Coalossal represents the final evolution of Roly-Coly, pure coal brought to life through millions of years of geological pressure and then set burning through battle and heat. The fire rock typing makes immediate sense when you understand coal's composition, ancient organic matter compressed into combustible stone that releases tremendous energy when ignited. Coalossal's Gigantamax form amplifies this concept to absurd proportions, transforming the Pokemon into walking mountain of coal with flames erupting from every surface and smoke pouring into the sky like industrial furnace. The signature move G-Max Volcalith sets rocks on the field that damage opponents at the end of each turn for 4 turns, effectively creating volcano eruption in delayed effect form, pressure building until it has no choice but to explode across everything. The design references both natural coal deposits and humanity's industrial revolution, the way burning coal powered factories and trains and reshaped entire world through heat and steam and mechanical force. Coalossal's body temperature became a point of strange contention when the Pokédex revealed that Gigantamax Coalossal's internal heat only reaches 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately the same temperature as Flareon, a small cat-like Pokemon that fits comfortably in a backpack. For a creature whose entire existence revolves around being a colossal burning furnace, that temperature feels disappointingly low, barely hotter than some real-world industrial processes, and nowhere near the intensity suggested by its appearance. The disconnect between visual design and stated temperature highlights a recurring problem in Pokemon's Pokédex entries, the tendency to assign specific numbers that sound impressive without considering how they compare to other entries or real-world physics. A creature the size of a building made entirely of burning coal should generate temperatures that make 3,600 degrees look like a candle flame, but instead it matches a small mammal's output, suggesting either the Pokédex is lying or coal in the Pokemon world works very differently than it does in reality. Players tend to ignore these discrepancies, focusing on battles and aesthetics rather than scientific accuracy, but they create strange moments where the fiction's internal logic breaks down under examination. Sizzlipede and Centiskorch brought arthropods into fire-type territory, radiator-backed centipedes whose segmented bodies glow with internal heat and release flames when threatened. The design draws from real centipedes' defensive behaviors, how they curl up and release noxious chemicals when attacked, and reinterprets those behaviors through fire-type lens, creating creature that burns rather than poisons. Sizzlipede in particular shows interesting ecological relationships, sharing common ancestor with Skorupi, according to Pokédex entries, and maintaining rivalry with Venipede, despite living in completely different regions. These connections suggest firebug combinations evolved multiple times across different continents, adaptation that proved successful enough to persist across separated populations. Centiskorch's signature move, Fire Lash, lowers opponents' defense while dealing damage, representing how the heated segments of its body leave burns that weaken resistance to future attacks. The move became useful in competitive play for breaking through defensive Pokémon, though Centiskorch itself struggled to find consistent role due to mediocre stats and bad defensive typing that left it weak to water, rock, and flying attacks. Gigantamax Centiskorch extended to absurd lengths, 246 feet of burning arthropod coiled around a battlefield like living wall of flame. Only Eternamax Eternatus exceeded this height, making Gigantamax Centiskorch the second tallest Pokémon in existence, though its serpentine shape meant most of that length spread horizontally rather than reaching skyward. The signature move, G-Max Centiferno, trapped opponents in swirling flames for 4 to 5 turns, preventing switching and forcing them to take residual damage while locked in place. This made Centiskorch useful for trapping and eliminating specific threats, though its weakness to common attacking types meant it needed careful positioning to avoid getting knocked out before it could spring the trap. The entire evolutionary line demonstrated how fire types could draw from unexpected animal sources, bugs not typically associated with heat suddenly becoming viable through creative design that emphasized temperature regulation and defensive burning rather than aggressive flamers. In Galar's competitive scene, Centiskorch saw occasional use, but never became top-tier threat, its niche too specific and its weaknesses too exploitable for consistent success. Fuecoco's line broke the Fire-type starter zodiac pattern that fans had spent years constructing, theory that every fire starter represented one of the 12 Chinese zodiac animals. Charmander was the dragon, Cyndaquil the rat, Torchic the rooster, Chimchar the monkey, Tepig the pig, Fennekin the dog, Litten the tiger, and Scorbunny the rabbit, leaving only snake, horse, ox, and ram unclaimed. Fuecoco, as a crocodile, fit exactly none of these categories, definitively disproving the pattern that seemed too consistent to be coincidence. Some fans tried to force connections, claiming Fuecoco represented the snake through its reptilian nature, or the dragon through its eventual evolution into Skeledirge, but these explanations required reaching so far that they undermined the entire theory. The simpler explanation was that Game Freak never intended zodiac pattern in the first place, and any apparent connections were coincidental or retrofitted by players looking for meaning in design choices that might have been completely random. Fuecoco's design drew from Spanish cultural elements, ghost pepper aesthetic combined with crocodilian features and eventual Day of the Dead influences in Skeledirge's ghostly bird familiar. Crocolore caused confusion when official Scarlet and Violet promotional material mentioned it uses the fiery egg on its head as part of a move, but no such move has ever been shown in-game, anime, or any other media. The egg sits prominently on Crocolore's head, clearly important to its design, glowing with internal heat, and apparently serving some strategic purpose, but what that purpose might be remains mystery. Players speculated it might hatch into the bird that appears in Skeledirge's final form, spirit companion born from egg rather than appearing from nowhere, but this was never confirmed. The official website's claim stands as error or teaser for content that was cut before release. Reminder that development processes involve countless ideas that never make it to final product. Crocolore's awkward middle evolution design, simultaneously goofy and endearing, made it popular despite its mechanical irrelevance, players appreciating how it looked perpetually confused while carrying its mystery egg through battles. Skeledirge completed the transformation from cute fire crocodile to spectral mariachi crocodile, with ghost bird familiar, Fire Ghost typing that created interesting strategic possibilities while staying true to Spanish Day of the Dead aesthetic. The bird, never given official name or explanation, appears when Skeledirge uses certain moves, manifesting from its throat or the egg imagery from previous evolutions, and launching attacks before dissolving back into spiritual energy. The design references traditional calaveras and mariachi performers, Skeledirge's body painted with skeletal patterns, and its overall silhouette suggesting musician entertaining crowd from beyond death. Its signature move, Torch Song, boosts special attack while dealing damage, stacking power the longer Skeledirge remains in battle, and creating snowball effect where each attack hits harder than the last. Combined with decent bulk and useful defensive typing, Skeledirge became immediately viable in competitive play, threatening to sweep teams if given setup time, while resisting common attacking types like bug, fire, grass, and ice. The ghost typing also granted immunity to normal and fighting moves, forcing opponents to use specific coverage or special attacks to damage it effectively. This defensive profile made Skeledirge excellent at forcing switches, coming in on resisted hits and threatening to boost while opponents scrambled to bring an appropriate counter. Will-O-Wisp added utility by crippling physical attackers, and Slack-Off provided reliable recovery to maintain health during longer battles. The entire package created Fire Ghost Pokémon that felt complete and purposeful, every aspect of its design supporting cohesive strategic identity. Players who initially dismissed the evolutionary line's bizarre appearance came around after using Skeledirge in battle, recognizing that weird didn't mean weak, and sometimes the strangest designs carried the most effective movesets. In Paldea's competitive environment, Skeledirge quickly established itself as one of the better fire-type options, bulky special attacker that could take hits and retaliate with increasing force until opponents either switched out or got burned down by accumulated Torch Song boosts. Charcadet represented rare case of branching evolution based on items tied to version exclusivity, evolution method that forced players to trade between Scarlet and Violet to complete the full evolutionary possibilities. In Scarlet, Auspicious Armor evolved Charcadet into Armarouge, special attacking fire psychic warrior with cannon arms and sleek armor design. In Violet, Malicious Armor created Ceruledge, physical attacking fire ghost duelist with blade arms and darker aesthetic. Both evolutions were viable competitively, Armarouge serving as special tank with decent bulk and powerful armor cannon move, while Ceruledge became fast physical sweeper with bitter blade for recovery and sword stance for setup. The split design philosophy meant players had to choose which version to buy, based partially on which Charcadet evolution they preferred, artificial scarcity creating value through exclusivity. Armarouge's design drew from European knights and musketeers, armor color scheme suggesting nobility and honor, fighting style based on maintaining distance and using superior firepower to control battlefield. Armor Cannon, its signature move, dealt massive special damage but lowered both defenses afterward, glass cannon approach that required careful timing and positioning. Flash Cannon and Psychic provided coverage, and Trick Room support turned Armarouge's low speed into advantage, letting it move first in reversed conditions. The Psychic typing granted telekinetic control over the battlefield, Armarouge mentally directing its fired projectiles and setting up energy barriers to protect itself from retaliation. Competitively, it found niche in Trick Room teams and as special attacker on balanced squads, though its defensive drops from Armor Cannon limited how long it could stay active. Ceruledge embraced opposite philosophy, close-range combat specialist that rushed opponents and recovered damage through life-stealing Bitter Blade. The ghost typing made it immune to fighting and normal attacks, while the fire typing covered its natural weaknesses and provided stab on powerful moves like Flare Blitz. Swords Dance setup made Ceruledge terrifying sweeper, boosting attack to levels where even resisted hits dealt significant damage. Shadow Claw and Close Combat provided coverage, and Poltergeist added Ghost Stab that could bypass defense boosts by targeting held items instead of defensive stats. The design aesthetic leaned into Dark Knight archetype, Cursed Warrior wielding forbidden flames, purple and black color scheme suggesting corruption or forbidden power. Some players preferred Armarouge's noble appearance, while others gravitated towards Ceruledge's edgy design, creating divide in community that mirrored the version exclusivity. Iron Moth arrived from future timeline as Paradox Pokémon, mechanical moth whose wings generated light and heat through technological rather than biological means. When Iron Moth fell asleep, the orange glow of its wings shut off completely, revealing they were never actual wings, but rather glowing panels that mimicked organic flight structures through artificial means. This detail separated it from Volcarona, the ancient moth whose wings burned with actual flames, creating interesting contrast between past and future, biology and technology, natural fire and synthesized heat. Iron Moth's special attack stat ranked among the highest of any fire type, access to Quiver Dance, and powerful stab moves, making it capable of sweeping entire teams if given single free turn to set up. The futuristic design appealed to players who wanted fire types that felt advanced rather than primitive, creatures that mastered heat through an understanding and engineering rather than just biological adaptation. The Paradox Pokémon concept as whole raised questions about timeline coherence and whether these creatures were glimpses of potential futures or alternate realities that existed simultaneously with present. Iron Moth's technological basis suggested that in its timeline, Pokémon evolved into or were replaced by machines, organic life, giving way to synthetic alternatives that could perform the same functions more efficiently. This darker reading transformed Iron Moth from cool robot moth into harbinger of future, where traditional Pokémon ceased to exist, replaced by superior mechanical versions that retained elemental powers but lost whatever made them truly alive. Players rarely engaged with these implications during casual play, focusing instead on Iron Moth's competitive viability and striking visual design, but the existential questions lingered beneath surface for those who cared to notice them. Chi-Yu embodied malice given a physical form, beads of hatred that absorbed centuries of human wickedness and manifested as goldfish swimming through flames. The design drew from Chinese mythology and the idea that emotions could achieve physical presence if concentrated enough over sufficient time. Chi-Yu's true form existed in the beads, the fish body merely vessel created to contain and direct the malevolent energy that had built up across generations of human conflict. Pokédex entries described wars fought to claim these beads, suggesting their power was recognized and desired despite their corrupting influence. The Darkfire typing reflected this duality, heat born from anger rather than passion, flames that burned because they hated rather than because they wanted to create or destroy for any purpose beyond inflicting harm. Competitively, Chi-Yu became an immediate problem in Scarlet and Violet, special attack stat combined with Beads of Ruin ability, reducing special defense of all opponents on field, creating a situation where even resistant Pokémon took massive damage from its attacks. Dark Pulse, Overheat, and Nasty Plot turned Chi-Yu into setup sweeper that could dismantle teams in a few turns, and its unusual typing granted useful resistances while avoiding some of the weaknesses that plagued pure fire types. The speed tier placed it just fast enough to outrun most threats while not being so fast that it wasted stat points on unnecessary speed. This perfect balance of power, coverage, ability, and stats made Chi-Yu over-centralizing in early Paldea competitive, forcing every team to account for it, or risk getting swept, and ultimately leading to its ban from most formats until metagame could develop counters and checks that didn't require warping entire team structures around single Pokemon. The bead's legendary status matched their in-game power, creature that required sealing away because nothing else could safely contain the horrid bad it represented. Ogerpon, in Hearthflame Mask form, demonstrated that fire typing could be added temporarily through held items, transformation that changed entire strategic approach while maintaining core grass-type identity. The mask granted fire moves and stab bonuses while worn, but removing it reverted Ogerpon to pure grass-type, creating interesting decision points about whether the coverage was worth the item slot. The design incorporated Japanese Oni mask traditions, demons wearing faces that granted them specific powers and personalities, Ogerpon collecting these masks and using them to become different versions of itself depending on situation. Hearthflame specifically made Ogerpon more aggressive, fire moves encouraging offensive play that contradicted the usual defensive utility of grass types. The masks themselves told story about identity and performance, the way wearing different faces let Ogerpon navigate social situations and battles that would have been impossible with just its base form. This theatrical element connected back to fire type's relationship with passion and transformation, the way heat changes everything it touches and creates new possibilities through destruction of old forms. Ogerpon's violent fighting style in Hearthflame form, using its club and vines to stab rather than whip opponents, emphasized how fire transformed even its methods, making it more direct and brutal than the other mask variants. Players who used Ogerpon competitively had to choose which mask best fit their team composition and strategy, Hearthflame offering different benefits than Wellspring, Cornerstone, or Teal masks, each transformation creating different Pokemon from same base creature. Gouging Fire emerged as Paradox Pokemon from ancient past, or possible past, or imagined past, the game's lore remaining deliberately ambiguous about whether these creatures were real historical versions or fabrications based on old descriptions and fossil records. Classified as fossil Pokemon in Violet's Pokédex, despite not being revived from actual fossils, Gouging Fire occupied strange categorical space between ancient creature and modern interpretation of ancient creature. The design suggested prehistoric Entei, quadrupedal fire beast with saber-tooth features and volcanic characteristics, existing before legendary beasts were created through Ho-Oh's resurrection. This created timeline paradox if taken literally, suggesting Entei existed before becoming Entei, which made no sense unless Paradox Pokemon weren't actually from past or future at all, but rather manifestations of human imagination given in form through terrestrial energy and crystalline dreams. Competitively, Gouging Fire brought physical fire dragon typing with powerful stats and access to Morning Sun for recovery, making it bulky offensive threat that could take hits while dishing out massive damage through Flare Blitz and Dragon Claw. The ancient design aesthetic, all sharp edges and primal power, contrast and contrasted with its strategic sophistication, careful balance of offense and defense that required thought rather than just clicking most powerful move available. Players appreciated having another physical fire dragon option beyond Reshiram, something accessible in regular play rather than being locked behind legendary restrictions. The fossil classification added flavor without affecting gameplay, reminder that not all fire types needed to be alive. In traditional sense, some could be memories made real, heat from ages past brought forward into present, through strange energy and stranger physics. As we drift deeper into understanding how fire manifests across so many different forms, the patterns start to emerge not in typing or stats, but in philosophy. Fire types represent transformation more than any other type. The way heat changes matter from one state to another, solid to liquid, to gas to plasma, each step requiring energy and releasing it in equal measure. Every fire Pokémon embodies this transformation somehow, either through evolution that dramatically alters their appearance and capabilities, through moves that sacrifice health for power, or through abilities that trigger only when pushed to desperate circumstances. Blaze ability activates when health drops below 1/3, giving Fire move's power boost exactly when Pokémon needs it most. Last desperate surge before falling. That mechanical representation of fighting harder when losing captures something essential about fire's nature, the way it burns brightest just before fuel runs out, intensity increasing as available resources decrease until nothing remains but ash and memory. The Pokédex entries for fire types often mention temperatures, specific numbers meant to convey power through scientific measurement, but these numbers rarely make sense when compared to each other or to real-world physics. Magcargo's body temperature supposedly reaches 18,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun, which would immediately vaporize anything within several miles and make it impossible to catch or train. Charizard's flames can melt boulders, requiring temperatures over 2,000 degrees, while Flareon stores heat internally at similar temperatures without melting itself. These discrepancies exist because the people writing Pokédex entries aren't scientists and don't need to be. The entries serve narrative purpose rather than educational one, creating a sense of wonder and power through big numbers regardless of whether those numbers hold up under examination. Players who care about consistency learn to ignore specific measurements and focus instead on relative comparisons, understanding that when Pokédex says a Pokémon is hot, it means very hot, and exact temperature matters less than the image being created. Fire types also tend to have lower defense stats on average compared to other types, glass cannons that hit hard but can't take hits in return. This makes strategic sense given fire's nature, destructive force that consumes fuel quickly and burns out if not carefully controlled. Water types can afford to be defensive walls because water can exist indefinitely without changing, but fire requires constant consumption to maintain itself, always hungry, always burning toward its own extinction. The game mechanics mirror this reality through stats and abilities that reward aggressive play and punish passivity. Fire types work best when attacking, using their natural power advantage to eliminate threats before those threats can retaliate effectively. Defensive fire types like Torkoal and Coalossal exist, but require support to function, trick room or weather effects creating conditions where their natural disadvantages become manageable. The visual design of fire types has evolved across generations, early designs favoring literal flames on bodies or obvious heat sources like lava and magma, later designs getting more creative with how they incorporated fire typing into creatures that wouldn't naturally be associated with heat. Chandelure's ghostly flames, Salazzle's toxic chemistry, Talonflame's friction-based heat, each represent a different approach to same fundamental question: what makes something a fire type beyond just having flames? The answer seemed to be transformation and energy. Any Pokemon that actively changed its environment or itself through heat-based processes qualified regardless of whether it literally burned. This opened design space for fire types that didn't look traditionally fiery, creatures whose connection to heat came through unusual channels, but remained thematically consistent with the type's philosophy. Regional variants added another layer of complexity, showing how fire types adapted to different environments and circumstances. Hisuian, Growlithe, and Arcanine gained rock typing through exposure to volcanic regions, armor and element combining into form suited for harsh conditions. Alolan Marowak, though not originally fire type, evolved into fire ghost form through spiritual traditions unique to the islands, ghost fire of mourning made physical through bones and memories. These regional variants suggested fire typing wasn't a fixed trait, but rather something that could emerge or disappear based on environmental pressures and cultural contexts, adaptability built into the type itself. The relationship between fire types and the player base has always been interesting, with fire starters historically being most popular choices, despite grass type usually having easier time in early game battles. Something about fire's visual impact and perceived power made it attractive to new players who wanted to feel strong immediately, even if that strength came with drawbacks they wouldn't recognize until later. Charizard's continued dominance in popularity polls decades after Red and Blue released speaks to fire types' enduring appeal, the way they capture imagination through simple association with power and transformation and heat that changes everything it touches. Competitive fire types have waxed and waned across generations, sometimes dominating metagames through broken abilities or move combinations, other times relegated to low tiers because their weaknesses were too easily exploited. Stealth Rock's introduction in Generation 4 hit fire types particularly hard, entry hazard, that dealt massive damage to anything with fire-flying typing and made switches extremely costly. This single move reshaped competitive landscape, forcing fire types to either run heavy-duty boots or risk losing half their health every time they entered battle, and some never recovered from that indirect nerf. Charizard specifically struggled until the Mega Evolution gave it tools to work around the rock weakness, and even then required specific team support to function optimally. The thematic consistency across fire types remains their strongest element, the way even radically different designs like Turtonator and Delphox both feel like they belong to same type through shared visual language of heat and transformation. Orange and red dominate color schemes, with yellows and blacks appearing frequently as accents, creating immediately recognizable palette that signals fire typing before examining any other design and elements. Exceptions like Chandeler's purple flames or Reshiram's white fire stand out precisely because they break this pattern, using unusual colors to suggest unusual fire, heat that comes from sources beyond normal combustion. Fire types often serve as version mascots and box legendaries, Reshiram for white, Ho-Oh for gold, Groudon for ruby, each representing power and transformation on massive scale. These legendary fire types tend to have creation myths attached, stories about how they shaped the world or brought specific elements into being through their flames. Ho-Oh resurrects the dead, Reshiram seeks truth and burns away lies, Groudon raised continents from beneath oceans, each legend positioning fire as fundamentally creative force despite its association with destruction. This duality, fire that destroys but also makes room for new growth, appears throughout the type's history and remains central to understanding what fire types represent thematically. The move pools available to fire types have expanded significantly across generations, early games offering mostly special fire moves with few physical options, later generations adding physical fire, stab, like Flare Blitz and Fire Punch to accommodate mixed attackers and physical-focused fire types. This expansion gave designers more freedom in creating diverse fire types with different stat spreads and battle roles, no longer forced to make every fire type a special attacker just to use their stab effectively. Infernape benefited hugely from this mixed attacker that could threaten from both physical and special sides, and later fire types like Blaziken and Cinderace became dominant, partly through access to powerful physical fire moves that complemented their naturally high attack stats. Status moves associated with fire types tend to focus on offense and disruption rather than support. Will-O-Wisp crippling physical attackers through burns, Sunny Day boosting fire moves while weakening water attacks, both aggressive options that change battlefield conditions to favor fire types while punishing opponents. Few fire types learn recovery moves naturally, reinforcing the glass cannon identity and forcing players to rely on items or team support to maintain their fire type's health across long battles. Exceptions like Morning Sun and Slack Off typically appear on bulkier fire types designed to last multiple turns, but even these moves come with conditions. Morning Sun healing less in rain or sandstorm, creating situations where fire types' own offensive nature works against their ability to survive. The cultural impact of fire types extends beyond Pokémon into broader gaming and anime spheres, with fire starting powers being one of most common abilities given to protagonists and powerful characters across all media. This ubiquity makes fire types feel simultaneously special and familiar, powerful because fiction has trained audiences to recognize fire as symbol of strength, familiar because that same symbolism appears everywhere and feels almost cliché. Pokémon walks this line carefully, maintaining fire's association with power while finding novel ways to express that power through unexpected designs and surprising type combinations that keep fire types feeling fresh despite their fundamental predictability. Z-moves and Dynamax Gigantamax added new dimensions to fire types, giving them access to devastating single-use attacks or temporary transformations that amplified their natural strengths. Inferno Overdrive let any fire type become Nuclear Bomb for one turn, converting their strongest fire move into world-ending explosion that could knock out even resistant opponents. G-Max Wildfire and G-Max Centinferno created residual damage that persisted across multiple turns, giving fire types ways to pressure opponents even after the Gigantamax form ended. These generational mechanics tended to favor offensive types like fire, giving them new tools to overwhelm opponents rather than defensive options that might have helped them survive longer. This aligned with fire's established identity, but also meant fire types remained vulnerable in generations where these mechanics weren't available, relying on raw stats and move coverage to compete against types that naturally countered them. The existence of fire-type moves that hurt the user, Flare Blitz's recoil, and Overheat's special attack drop, V creates speed and defense drops, reinforces fire's self-destructive nature, and creates interesting risk-reward calculations. Using these moves means sacrificing something, health or stats or positioning, but the power gained often justifies the cost if it leads to knockouts and momentum. This mechanical expression of fire's consuming nature adds depth to battles involving fire types, forcing players to consider not just whether they can win the immediate exchange, but whether winning that exchange is worth what they'll lose in the process. Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no, and learning to recognize the difference separates good fire-type users from great ones. Fire types in the anime often serve as demonstration pieces, visually impressive Pokémon whose attacks create spectacular animations and whose personalities tend toward passionate extremes. Ash's Charizard, Infernape, and Incineroar all went through arcs involving pride and learning to trust, fire types' natural independence and strength becoming obstacles they had to overcome to become effective partners. This character writing reinforced fire typing as personality trait as much as combat ability, fire Pokémon being inherently harder to train and manage, but more rewarding once bonds were established. The anime's influence on how players perceive fire types cannot be overstated, Charizard's popularity owing as much to its anime portrayal as its in-game capabilities, and many players' first exposure to Pokémon came through the show rather than the games. Regional Pokédexes often feature fire types as mid to late game encounters rather than early routes, reflecting their perceived power and the way their weaknesses become more manageable as player teams develop and gain access to diverse move coverage. Sinnoh's infamous lack of fire types in Diamond and Pearl created situations where players who didn't choose Chimchar had almost no fire type options until reaching late game areas, forcing them to either go without fire coverage or use Ponyta Rapidash as their sole representative of the type. This scarcity made fire types feel more valuable in Sinnoh, rare resources that teams built around, rather than common options that could be swapped freely. Platinum corrected this somewhat by adding more fire types to regional decks, but the reputation stuck, Sinnoh remaining associated with fire scarcity in player memory. The overlap between fire types and dragon types creates interesting space where power fantasy meets elemental mastery, Reshiram and Charizard's X form being most prominent examples of fire dragons that embody both types' strengths. The combination tends towards special attacking, given both types' offensive leanings, but physical fire dragons, like Gouging Fire, prove the typing works equally well with different stat distributions. Fire Dragon resists grass, fire, bug, steel, and electric attacks while being weak to ground, rock, and dragon moves, creating defensive profile that's better than pure fire, but still vulnerable to common attacking types. The typing signals power and aggression, two of the most offensively focused types combined into single Pokémon that exists primarily to attack and overwhelm opponents through raw force. Legendary fire types often have world-shaping roles in their region's mythology, Groudon raising continents, Ho-Oh resurrecting the dead, Victini granting infinite energy to those it trusts, each legend positioning fire as transformative force capable of changing reality itself. These cosmic scale abilities contrast sharply with normal fire types' more grounded capabilities, creating hierarchy within the type where legendary status means not just being stronger, but being fundamentally different in what fire can accomplish. Regular fire types burn and heat and occasionally melt things. Legendary fire types reshape worlds and alter the fundamental rules of existence, and that gap between them remains unbridgeable no matter how well trained a regular fire type becomes. Fire types' role in completing the starter trio creates expectations and patterns that influence their design across every generation. The fire starter typically becomes bipedal in final evolution, usually gains secondary fighting type, or remains pure fire, and often has mixed offensive stats that allow both physical and special attacking. These trends aren't absolute. Typhlosion stayed pure fire and quadrupedal, Delphox went special fire psychic, but they appear often enough to feel intentional, design philosophy that treats fire starters as specific category with their own rules separate from other fire types. This consistency helps players feel comfortable with fire starters across generations while creating expectations that can be subverted for effect when designers want to surprise audiences. The relationship between fire and the sun appears repeatedly in Pokémon lore and design, from Solrock being associated with fire, despite not having the typing, to Chimchar Line's connection to Sun Wukong, to Ho-Oh's solar symbolism. Fire and solar energy aren't identical in reality. The sun produces light and heat through nuclear fusion rather than combustion, but thematically they overlap enough that Pokémon treats them as related concepts. This allows fire types to claim celestial connections and mythological weight beyond just being animals that are hot, positioning them as earthly representatives of cosmic forces that existed before life itself and will persist long after everything else burns out. Weather effects create interesting dynamics for fire types, harsh sunlight boosting their fire moves while reducing water damage, rain reducing fire moves while boosting water attacks that already threaten fire types. This makes weather control strategically important in battles featuring fire types, who benefit enormously from sun support but struggle under rain conditions. Pokémon like Torkoal and Ninetales can set weather themselves through abilities, creating self-sufficient fire types that bring their own support rather than requiring teammates to enable them, but this uses their ability slot and prevents them from running other potentially more valuable abilities. The weather game within competitive Pokémon adds a layer of strategy where fire types must either commit to sun teams fully or accept that weather will sometimes work against them and plan accordingly. Fire-type gyms and Elite Four members tend toward passionate, hot-headed personalities that match their type specialization, Blaine making terrible puns, Flannery being excitable and energetic, Kabu being stern but dedicated. These personality patterns reinforce fire as emotional type, one that responds to feelings and possession rather than cold calculation, though this characterization sometimes feels reductive and limits how fire specialists can be portrayed. Recent games have experimented with more diverse characterizations for fire-type trainers, showing that specializing in fire doesn't require specific personality traits, but the association between fire and passion remains strong enough that departures from it feel notable rather than natural. The sound design associated with fire-type moves matters more than players often realize. Crackling flames and whooshing eruptions creating auditory identity that makes fire attacks feel powerful even when damage numbers might not support that impression. Games with voiced cry systems give fire types roars and aggressive vocalizations that reinforce their offensive nature, while menu sounds for fire moves tend toward explosive impacts and burning ignitions that satisfy on sensory level beyond just the visual effect. This attention to audio helps fire types feel like fire types even in situations where their actual combat performance might be underwhelming, maintaining the power fantasy through sound design when mechanics can't support it. Fire types in spin-off games often retain their offensive focus, but gain new contexts where that focus creates different strategic possibilities. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon gives fire types room-clearing abilities that excel in dungeon environments, while Pokémon Unite positions them as burst damage dealers who spike down opponents during short windows. These different game formats let fire types express their core identity, high damage output, and transformation theme through mechanics appropriate to each game's specific design, proving the type's conceptual flexibility even while maintaining recognizable characteristics across all contexts. The breeding mechanics for fire types follow standard Pokémon rules, but often involve unusual egg groups, several fire types belonging to field and monster groups that allow interesting breeding combinations for move inheritance. Flame Body ability, common among fire types, halves egg hatching time when the Pokémon is in player's party, creating practical use for fire types beyond just battle. This utility cemented certain fire types like Talonflame and Coalossal as breeding favorites, players keeping them in parties specifically for egg hatching assistance, even when not actively training them for competition. Small quality of life considerations like this can determine which Pokémon players interact with regularly, and fire type's monopoly on Flame Body gave them persistent relevance even during metagame periods where they struggled competitively. Molten armor wraps around certain fire types like protective skin made from liquid stone, the way Heatran's metallic body channels volcanic heat through through veins of magma that never cool completely. Heatran stands as one of the strangest legendary Pokémon, neither male nor female guaranteed, gender ratios split evenly across encounters, unlike most legends that remain genderless entirely. This biological flexibility suggests Heatran reproduces somehow, possibly through volcanic birthing processes, or magma itself becomes a living creature through intense heat and pressure over geological time scones. The design references both spiders and furnaces, 8 legs allowing it to climb vertical walls in volcanic chambers, while its hollow interior stores heat at temperatures that would vaporize most materials instantly. Flash Fire ability makes Heatran immune to fire attacks and boosts its own fire moves when hit by flames, creating a fire type that thrives in environments where everything burns constantly and other creatures would perish within seconds. The Steel Fire typing grants Heatran incredible defensive profile, 9 resistances, and 1 immunity offsetting its weaknesses to ground, fighting, and water attacks. This makes Heatran one of the bulkiest fire types competitively, able to switch into attacks that would flatten other fire Pokémon and threaten retaliation with Magma Storm or Earth Power. Magma Storm traps opponents for up to 5 turns while dealing residual damage each turn, forcing switches or accepting slow death through burning, and Earth Power provides coverage against rock and fire types that would otherwise wall Heatran completely. The combination of bulk, power, and trapping made Heatran defining presence in competitive Pokémon for over a decade, centralizing metagame and forcing specific counter strategies that entire teams built around. Heatran's crater home in Stark Mountain creates visual poetry, legendary Pokémon born from same forces that shaped the mountain itself, living embodiment of volcanic power that predated human civilization and will persist long after current age ends. The temple built around Stark Mountain by ancient people suggests Heatran was worshipped or at least respected enough to merit religious architecture, fire deity, that demanded acknowledgement even if it never interfered directly with human affairs. This religious dimension adds weight to catching Heatran, player character claiming something that entire cultures once revered, reducing God to teammate through Pokeball technology that forcibly binds even the most powerful beings to human service. Victini carries burden of infinite energy and guaranteed victory, mythology that sounds empowering until you consider the implications of never being allowed to lose. The Pokédex describes how trainers with Victini always win battles, not through their own skill or strategy, but through Victini's power warping probability and outcomes until victory becomes the only possible result. This strips agency from both trainer and opponent, reducing competitive battle to predetermined conclusion rather than genuine contest of strength and tactics. The V-shaped victory motif appears throughout Victini's design, ears and tail forming V's, moves like V-Create and Victory Star reinforcing the letter association, transforming abstract concept of winning into visual identity that follows Victini everywhere it goes. V-Create became Victini's signature move, overwhelmingly powerful fire attack that drops users' defense, special defense, and speed after use, trading everything for single, devastating strike. The move's mechanics mirror Victini's lore perfectly, achieving victory through ultimate sacrifice, burning so bright that nothing remains afterward except the result. Consequences be damned, as long as the win condition gets met. Competitively, this made Victini Glass Cannon that could delete one opponent before becoming vulnerable itself, requiring support and prediction to use effectively, but capable of shifting entire battle momentum when deployed correctly. The speed drop particularly hurt, turning Victini from a reasonably fast attacker into slow target that opponents could easily revenge kill, but the raw power often justified this risk if it meant removing key opposing Pokémon from play. Victini's event-exclusive status meant most players never obtained it legally. Mythical Pokémon distributed only through limited time events that required physical presence at specific stores or participation in online distributions during narrow windows. This artificial scarcity created collector's market where Victini became valuable trading commodity, digital creature worth real money in unofficial markets, despite Nintendo's stance against such transactions. The exclusivity also meant Victini remained banned from most competitive formats, legendary status, and limited availability, making it unavailable for standard tournament play, relegating it to special formats and casual battles where power level mattered less than team composition and strategy. The mythology surrounding Victini speaks to deeper themes about what victory means and whether guaranteed success diminishes the value of achieving it. If Victini ensures its trainer always wins, did the trainer actually win, or did Victini win while trainer watched? The philosophical question matters less in actual gameplay, where Victini functions as strong fire psychic attacker with interesting move coverage, but it lingers in the lore, unanswered and troubling. Some stories suggest Victini grants victory only to those with pure hearts, filtering for moral worthiness before bestowing its power, but this creates new problems about who decides what constitutes pure heart and whether victory should be merit-based reward rather than supernatural gift granted to select few. Reshiram embodies truth through white fire that burns away lies and reveals reality beneath deception, counterpart to Zekrom's idealistic lightning that pursues vision of perfect future. The dichotomy between truth and ideals, what is versus what should be, defines Reshiram's existence and drives its actions throughout Unova's mythology. Ancient Unova split into two kingdoms when twin heroes couldn't reconcile their different approaches to leadership, one seeking truth through honest examination of current conditions, other pursuing ideals through vision of better world. Reshiram sided with Truthseeker, lending its power to reveal reality no matter how uncomfortable that reality might be, while Zekrom supported Ideal Pursuer, empowering dreams and ambitions that reached beyond present limitations. The white coloration defied expectations for fire types, traditionally associated with reds and oranges. Reshiram's pristine appearance suggesting purity and clarity rather than destructive heat. The blue eyes contrasted with the white body, fire burning so intensely it transcended normal flame colors and became something purer, heat without smoke or ash or any waste product, perfect combustion that left nothing behind except truth. Blue Flare, Reshiram's signature move, dealt massive fire damage while having low chance to burn opponent, representation of truth's power to harm even when delivered without malicious intent, facts burning as surely as flames when they contradict cherished beliefs. Reshiram's Dragonfire typing created an interesting competitive profile, weak to ground, rock, and dragon attacks, but resistant to fire, grass, electric, and steel moves, defensive spread that rewarded careful positioning and type advantage management. Turbo Blaze ability ignored defensive abilities like Flash Fire and Storm Drain, forcing damage through regardless of opponent's protective measures, truth burning through defenses, because truth cannot be blocked or redirected or ignored, no matter how much we might want it to be. This made Reshiram threatening even against Pokémon normally resistant to fire attacks, ability to force damage, creating situations where switching became only safe option. The end storyline in Black and White positioned Reshiram as test of players' convictions, legendary Pokémon that responded only to those who demonstrated commitment to truth regardless of personal cost. This moral dimension elevated Reshiram beyond just another powerful legendary, transforming it into a philosophical position given physical form, asking players whether they valued truth enough to wield fire that could burn them as easily as their enemies. The answer was always yes in gameplay terms, player necessarily becoming truth seeker to progress story. But the question itself mattered, forcing engagement with ideas about honesty and self-examination that most games for children carefully avoided. Reshiram and Zekrom's eventual fusion into Kyurem through DNA splicers created Kyurem White, combined form that brought truth and absence together into something colder and more distant than either component alone. The Ice-Fire combination worked mechanically through Iceburn, signature move that charged for one turn before releasing devastating attack with high burn chance, delayed truth that built power through patience before striking with accumulated force. The fusion suggested that truth and ideal were never truly separate, that pursuing one inevitably led toward other, and only through accepting both could anyone approach completeness. Kyurem's empty husk gained warmth through Reshiram's flames, while Reshiram's absolute truth gained perspective through Kyurem's cold evaluation, creating synthesis that transcended both original forms. The Generation 5 mythology built entire regional conflict around truth versus ideals, using fire and electric dragons to embody philosophical positions that shaped how people governed themselves and related to Pokémon. This ambitious storytelling elevated Fire-type beyond just combat element into narrative device that asked meaningful questions about what we value and why. Reshiram's fire burned because truth must burn, uncomfortable and purifying, destroying comfortable lies to reveal difficult realities that demand acknowledgement and response. In children's game about catching colorful monsters, Reshiram stood as a reminder that even simple stories can carry complex themes if developers care enough to embed them properly. Fennekin's evolutionary line returns to our attention through a different lens, examining how fire-psychic combination creates space for intellect and strategy rather than just raw power and emotion. Delphox uses wands and mysticism not as aesthetic choice but as fundamental aspect of how it relates to fire, tool user rather than creature, whose body naturally produces flames. This technological approach, even if the technology is magical rather than mechanical, separates Delphox from most fire types who simply are fire without needing external focuses or catalysts. The stick that breaks and carries everywhere transforms from simple twig into proper wand through evolution, refinement that mirrors the Pokemon's own development, from playful fox child to serious mage whose predictions shape battles before they begin. The ears styled like witch's hat reinforce Delphox's magical identity, design element that immediately communicates spellcasting and fortune-telling even to players unfamiliar with European witchcraft traditions. The robes flow naturally from its fur, suggesting formal costume and organic growth simultaneously, creature that chose to present itself ceremonially without actually wearing separate clothing. This attention to how design elements convey character without explicit explanation demonstrates fire-type design at its most sophisticated, every visual choice supporting unified thematic identity that makes Delphox recognizable as fire psychic mage even in silhouette. Competitively, Delphox struggled against faster special attackers and physical priority users who could eliminate it before it set up or struck back effectively. The defensive typing that granted 6 weaknesses made switching difficult, and while magician ability sometimes stole useful items, it required running without item yourself, situational gimmick that rarely justified the loss of leftovers or life orb or other standard equipment. These mechanical limitations didn't diminish Delphox's thematic success, player satisfaction coming from aesthetic and conceptual identity rather than tournament viability, appreciation for what Delphox represented more than what it accomplished in competitive battle. The relationship between fire and fortune-telling deserves deeper exploration, why witches in folklore used flames for divination and how that tradition informed Delphox's design. Fire's constantly changing nature, never the same twice, makes it perfect medium for reading patterns and interpreting signs, randomness becoming meaningful through trained observation and wishful interpretation. Delphox watching flames and predicting futures mirrors this tradition, psychic powers giving actual substance to practices that in real world rely on suggestion and cold reading. The combination of fire and psychic types becomes necessary rather than arbitrary, two elements that work together to create creature whose fire reveals truth about future rather than just burning present. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how mega evolutions affected fire-type identity across Generation 6. Both Charizard's forms claiming spotlight, but other fire types receiving transformations too. Blaziken became faster and stronger through mega evolution, already dominant sweeper becoming unstoppable force that could clean weakened teams through combination of speed boost and powerful close combat and flare blitz. The design added flame mohawk and wrist blades, visual signals that Megaform was more aggressive than base, though functionally, the stat boosts mattered more than aesthetic changes. Houndoom gained solar power through Mega Evolution, but lost its horn in favor of bone armor aesthetic that made it look more skeletal and demonic, Dark Firehound becoming literal Hellhound, whose appearance as frightened children and thrilled edgy teenagers. Mega Camerupt transformed from goofy dopey camel into volcanic mountain that erupted continuously, humor replaced by genuine threat, special attack stat jumping high enough to make eruption devastatingly powerful under Trick Room conditions. The transformation represented fire type's capacity for surprise, creature that looked harmless, revealing destructive potential that nothing about its base form suggested. This gap between appearance and capability created interesting narrative space where fire types could be underestimated, then prove doubters wrong through overwhelming force, vindication through burning. Mega Evolution, as mechanic, favored offensive types like fire, giving them temporary power spikes that capitalized on their natural strengths rather than shoring up defensive weaknesses. This design philosophy meant fire types benefited disproportionately from Mega Evolution system, several receiving forms that became competitively viable or even dominant in their respective metagames. The temporary nature of transformation also matched fire's ephemeral quality, power that burned bright for limited time before reverting to normal, intensity over endurance, memorable moments over sustained pressure. Primal Groudon stands apart from all other fire types through sheer scale of power and influence over battlefield conditions, weather-setting ability that didn't just boost fire moves, but prevented water attacks entirely through desolate land, creating harsh sunlights so intense that rain evaporated before falling. This mechanic broke fundamental type interactions, water types unable to damage Groudon with their stab moves, forced to rely on coverage or hope teammates could remove it before it set up too deeply. The primal reversion aesthetic, returning to ancient form that predated current limitations, suggested Groudon's current state was a weakened version of what it once was, Continent Razor diminished through ages into something merely powerful rather than genuinely godlike. The fire typing came through primal reversion, base. Groudon being pure ground before transformation added fire and elevated it into force of nature that reshaped weather and rewrote type matchup charts. Precipice Blades provided ground stab that hit multiple opponents in doubles, while Eruption and Fire Blast covered fire damage, giving Primal Groudon options regardless of opponent composition. The automatic weather generation meant teams built around Primal Groudon rather than including it as member, entire strategy revolving around maintaining desolate land and capitalizing on its benefits before opponent could neutralize, whether through their own primal Pokémon or weather setters. Groudon's mythology about raising continents from beneath the oceans positioned it as creator deity, force responsible for dry land existing at all rather than entire world remaining underwater. This creation myth elevated Fire-type beyond just destructive element into foundational force without which current civilization couldn't exist. Fire as prerequisite for land, and land as prerequisite for terrestrial life. The eternal conflict with Kyogre represented balance between fire and water, expansion and contraction, creation and erosion, neither side able to permanently defeat the other because reality required both to exist in tension. This mythological depth gave Primal Groudon weight that most legendary fire types lacked, tying it into fundamental questions about how world came to be and what forces maintain current equilibrium. The visual design of Primal Groudon incorporated magma patterns across its body, glowing cracks suggesting something molten barely contained beneath a rocky exterior, continents themselves made mobile and given will. The black coloration contrasted with traditional fire-type reds and oranges, suggesting heat so intense it transcended normal flame colors, volcanic power that operated on scales where normal combustion rules no longer applied. This design philosophy, using darkness and absence of light to suggest ultimate heat, appeared elsewhere in fire-type design, but never as effectively as Primal Groudon's imposing silhouette, radiating menace and tectonic force. Cinderace arrived as Generation 8's fire starter, completing evolution from cute rabbit to soccer-playing striker, whose pyro ball attacks combined an athletic skill with fire manipulation. The design drew obvious inspiration from professional athletes, specifically soccer players, given Galar's Britain inspiration, creating fire-type whose flames came from passion and competition rather than biology or environment. Pyro Ball's signature move involved kicking a flaming soccer ball at opponents with enough force to potentially burn them, special effect representing how intensely Cinderace played its chosen sport. The move's high critical hit ratio suggested Cinderace knew how to find weaknesses and exploit them, trained competitor rather than wild creature, intelligence and practice, creating opportunities that raw power alone couldn't generate. Libero ability made Cinderace incredibly versatile, changing its typing to match whatever move it used before executing that move, giving it stab on every attack and constantly shifting defensive profile to avoid being easily revenge killed. This versatility combined with excellent speed and attack stats made Cinderace dominant in competitive play until Libero got banned or restricted in various formats, too flexible and unpredictable for healthy metagame. The ability represented athletic adaptability, star player who could fill any position and excel regardless of assignment, fire type, that succeeded through skill and intelligence rather than just overwhelming force. Gigantamax Cinderace gained giant fireball battlefield that it kicked around during signature move, G-Max Fireball, creating spectacle that matched the flashy athlete aesthetic perfectly. The giant form looked less like biological creature and more like animated cartoon character, stylized and exaggerated in ways that emphasized personality over realism. This design approach worked for Cinderace because its entire concept revolved around performance and showmanship, fire type, whose flames existed to entertain and impress as much as damage opponents. The crowd-pleasing element aligned with fire types' traditional association with spectacle, attacks that look impressive even when mechanically simple. The evolutionary line from Scorbunny through Reboot to Cinderace, showed progression from enthusiastic amateur to confident professional, maturation through dedication to craft rather than just aging. Scorbunny's boundless energy became Reboot's focused determination, became Cinderace's polished skill, each stage representing different level of commitment to soccer-themed identity. This narrative arc gave Cinderace emotional resonance beyond just being a strong fire starter, creature that worked for its power and earned respect through discipline rather than having strength granted through lucky genetics or legendary status. As we drift deeper into Fire's relationship with competition and performance, the pattern of fire starters becoming fighting types or fighting adjacent emerges clearly. Blaziken, Infernape, Emboar, and Cinderace all incorporated martial or athletic elements into their designs, creatures whose fire manifested through physical contest and competitive spirit. This design pattern created fatigue among some players who wanted fire starters to explore different thematic spaces, frustration that peaked with Emboar being third consecutive firefighting starter and continued even when later starters like Cinderace avoided fighting type label while maintaining clearly combat-focused designs. The connection between fire and fighting makes thematic sense though, both types representing passion and intensity and willingness to throw yourself completely into conflict without holding back. Fire burns hottest when fed properly, and fighting excels through commitment and training, shared philosophy even if mechanical expression differs. Combining them creates Pokémon that embody complete dedication to competition, creatures that live for battle and define themselves through contest rather than any other quality. This appeals to players who approach Pokémon competitively, seeing their teams as athletes training for tournament success, but alienates those who prefer exploration and story over battling. The pendulum has swung back and forth across generations, some fire starters embracing fighting aesthetic fully, while others reject it in favor of magic or performance or other thematic directions. Delphox and Skeledirge specifically avoided any fighting connection, choosing mysticism and music over athletics, showing that fire starters could succeed without needing martial identity. This variety across generations gives players options, choosing a starter that matches their preferred playstyle and aesthetic rather than feeling forced into similar experiences every generation. Alolan Marowak represents a unique case of regional variant, gaining fire typing where original form had none. Ghost-fire combination emerging from Alolan funeral practices and spiritual traditions rather than environmental adaptation. The bones Marowak carries became conduits for spectral flames, green fire that burns without consuming physical fuel, sustained entirely through connection to spirit world and ancestral memories. This transformation from pure ground type to ghost fire created one of the most interesting regional variants, mechanically, completely new type combination, with different strengths and weaknesses that made Alolan Marowak viable in situations where original form would fail. The cultural specificity of Alolan Marowak's transformation deserves attention. Design that couldn't exist in anywhere except island region with strong traditions around death and remembrance. The green flames specifically reference Hitodama again, ghostly fires that appear in Japanese folklore but adapted to Polynesian setting through bone aesthetic and tribal patterns incorporated into design. This cultural blending created something unique, fire-type, that drew from multiple traditions without reducing any of them to shallow stereotypes, respectful incorporation of death imagery into children's game that trusted young players to handle themes around mortality and remembrance. Competitively, Alolan Marowak carved niche as Trick Room Sweeper, low speed becoming advantage under reversed conditions, Thick Club item doubling its attack stat to absurd levels that made Flare Blitz and Shadow Bone hit like truck. The coverage from 2 stab types meant very few Pokémon resisted both ghost and fire attacks, most opponents taking neutral or super effective damage from one or both of Alolan Marowak's primary attacks. Lightning Rod ability provided electric immunity and special attack boosts when hit by electric moves, creating situations where opponents trying to pivot around Marowak with electric attacks actually made it stronger and more threatening. The transformation from vengeful spirits in original Pokédex entries to ceremonial dancers in Alolan form reframed Marowak's entire identity, anger giving way to purpose, violence transforming into ritual. This character development across regional variants showed how environment shapes personality, same species becoming completely different being when raised under different cultural circumstances. Alolan Marowak dances with fire because movement and rhythm connected to ancestors, battle becoming spiritual practice rather than mere combat, every swing of its bone club a prayer and invocation simultaneously. Ho-Oh soars above all other fire-flying types through combination of resurrection mythology and rainbow wings that trail Aurora behind every movement. The gold and red coloration screams legendary status, prismatic feathers catching light and refracting it into spectrum that follows Ho-Oh like banner announcing divinity. Sacred Fire signature move burns opponents while carrying high chance of inflicting burn status, flame with religious significance, rather than just combat application, purification through heat that cleanses as it damages. The move's 50% burn rate made it devastating in combination with Ho-Oh's already strong physical attack stat, opponents' burned status reducing their physical attack, while burn damage chipped away at health every turn. The resurrection mythology stems from Ho-Oh's ability to revive the dead, specifically the 3 legendary beasts created when Ho-Oh resurrected Pokémon that died in Brass Tower's burning. This creation myth positioned Ho-Oh as life-giver, whose fire brings existence rather than taking it away, inversion of fire's typical association with destruction and ending. The choice to make fire-type responsible for resurrection, rather than water or grass or some other life-associated type, feels deliberate, suggesting fire purifies and transforms, but doesn't necessarily destroy, death and rebirth. Just different stages of same eternal cycle that fire facilitates through burning away old forms. Ho-Oh's competitive presence fluctuated across generations, amazing bulk and recovery through roost, making it difficult to eliminate, but modest speed and weakness to Stealth Rock, limiting its effectiveness in traditional team structures. Regenerator ability in Hidden Slot provided a passive healing when switching out, turning Ho-Oh into defensive pivot that could take hits and recover while switching to appropriate counter for whatever opponent sent in next. This defensive playstyle contradicted Ho-Oh's aggressive appearance and mythological status as Lifebringer through fire, but mechanically it made sense. Legendary Pokémon whose strength came from endurance rather than quick knockouts. The symbolic weight Ho-Oh carries as mascot for Gold version and representative of Johto region as whole cannot be overstated, its appearance in first episode of anime elevating it to near mystical status among fans who watched Ash begin his journey. The rainbow that appeared when Ho-Oh flew past became visual signature, permanent association between this Pokémon and symbol of hope and promise, connecting fire type to optimistic themes that felt unusual given type's traditional destructive connotations. This gentler characterization opened space for fire types that warmed without burning, comforted without consuming, existed as protective presence rather than threatening force. The rainbow, wing and silver wing items created interesting asymmetry, with Lugia, Ho-Oh requiring specific key item to trigger encounter, while Lugia needed different item, suggesting these legendaries weren't equals, but rather complementary opposites with different roles and requirements. Ho-Oh as Lifebringer needed Rainbow, symbol of promise and renewal, while Lugia as Stormcalmer needed Silver, symbol of clarity and peace. These symbolic associations ran throughout Generation 2's mythology, type matchups, and legendary encounters weaving together into cohesive narrative about balance and opposition, fire and water as eternal forces that defined reality through their interaction. Calyrex riding Spectrier or Glastrier creates interesting pseudo-fire relationships where the mount provides elements, while Calyrex itself supplies psychic and grass typing, but neither combination actually involves fire directly. The absence matters though. Crown Tundra legendary horses specifically avoiding fire typing despite obvious opportunities to include it through Spectrier's Phantom Flames or Glastrier's potential ice-fire fusion concepts. This choice kept fire type exclusive, preventing it from being just another element available to legendary fusion Pokémon, maintaining its special status through scarcity rather than ubiquity. Rapidash in both Cantonian and Galarian forms demonstrates how fire can manifest or disappear through regional adaptation, original maintaining fire typing, while Galarian traded fire for psychic while keeping fairy addition. This divergence showed how fire typing wasn't essential even for Pokémon, whose original identity revolved around being on fire, environment, and culture, capable of reshaping species so completely that fundamental aspects disappeared across evolutionary time. Galarian Rapidash's loss of flames suggested magic replaced heat in its biological niche, psychic power, and fairy enchantment, serving purposes that fire fulfilled in elsewhere, same solutions emerging from different elemental sources. The design philosophy behind regional variants allowed fire types to exist or not exist based on regional needs, rather than maintaining fire presence just for consistency's sake. Some variants gained fire typing, like Alolan Marowak and Hisuian Growlithe, while others lost it like Galarian Rapidash, creating ecosystem where fire appeared when advantageous and disappeared when obsolete. This flexibility made each regional dex feel more naturalistic, distributions reflecting environmental pressures rather than arbitrary design mandates, requiring certain types appear in minimum numbers. Moltres represents original legendary Firebird, predating Ho-Oh and establishing template that later fire-flying legendaries would reference or subvert. The simplicity of Moltres' concept, bird made of fire, contrasted with later legendaries' complex mythologies and multiple forms, purity of execution, replacing elaborate backstory. Yellow flames contrasting with the orange body created striking visual that immediately communicated fire-flying typing without requiring explanation, design efficiency that made Moltres iconic despite minimal lore support. The Kanto legendary bird trio as whole demonstrated restraint, each bird representing single element powerfully rather than trying to embody multiple concepts simultaneously. Galarian Moltres abandoned fire completely in favor of dark flying combination that felt jarring to players familiar with Original's fiery presence. The dark purple flames suggestion fire that burned cold or fire that consumed light rather than producing it, paradoxical heat that contradicted everything fire typing traditionally represented. This radical reinterpretation divided fans, some appreciating bold creative choice, while others felt it disrespected original design, controversy that highlighted how strongly players associated specific Pokémon with their typing even when regional variants were supposed to allow exactly this kind of transformation. The competitive viability of original Moltres remained steady across generations, despite weakness to Stealth Rock that costed half its health on entry, powerful special attacks, and decent speed tier letting it function as wall breaker that could force switches and claim knockouts before getting revenge killed. Hurricane gave it flying stab that hit harder than most expected, perfect accuracy in rain, making Moltres surprisingly dangerous on water-type heavy teams that could support it through weather. The niche remained narrow, but players who mastered it found Moltres capable of performances that belied its mid-tier reputation, another example of Fire-type succeeding through proper support and strategic deployment despite apparent limitations. Typhlosion's evolution from Quilava brings a final realization of Volcano Pokémon concept, eruption mechanics made flesh through fire that jets from holes along its back when threatened or excited. The design referenced honey badger defensive behaviors, erupting with deterrent flames when grabbed, transforming physical vulnerability into counterattack opportunity. Hisuian Typhlosion added ghost typing and transformed aesthetic from aggressive badger to lazy sloth with eternal stare, flames becoming purple and ghostly rather than orange and energetic. Complete personality shift through regional adaptation while maintaining core fire identity. The choice to make Hisuian Typhlosion Fire Ghost rather than pure Ghost or Ghost, with different secondary typing, suggested fire remained essential even when everything else changed, thermal element too fundamental to remove completely. The purple flames matched Chandelure and Alolan Marowak's spectral fire, establishing visual language for ghostly combustion that felt consistent across generations, despite these Pokémon emerging from different regions and circumstances. This attention to maintaining coherent aesthetic signals helped players understand ghost fire as a distinct category separate from normal fire or pure ghost, flames that existed between states and refused to commit fully to either life or death. Competitively, Hisuian Typhlosion struggled more than original form, stats and move pool not quite supporting either physical or special playstyle effectively, caught between approaches without excelling at either. The signature move, Infernal Parade, dealt damage that scaled with status conditions, but required opponent actually be statused, situational requirement that limited reliability. Will-O-Wisp helped enable this, but using turn to status meant sacrificing turn that could have dealt damage directly, unclear whether combo justified setup time required. These mechanical limitations meant Hisuian Typhlosion saw more casual play than competitive use, appreciated for aesthetic and regional variant novelty rather than tournament viability. The starters as a group demonstrate Fire-type's role in franchise structure, always present as one of three initial choices, always designed to appeal to specific player fantasy about power and transformation. Fire starters tend toward highest attack stats among their generation's trio, establishing them as offensive options for players who prioritize damage dealing over defense or utility. This pattern creates expectations that influence how players approach team building, Fire starter on team, usually filling physical or special attacker role rather than defensive pivot or support, natural specialization that comes from stat distributions and move pool design. As we continue drifting through these flame-touched tales, Torkoal emerges as defensive fire type that defies conventional wisdom about glass cannons and offensive focus. Based on Giant Tortoise with Volcanic Shell, Torkoal uses Drought ability to set harsh sunlight and support sun teams despite not particularly benefiting from sun itself beyond fire move boosts. This selfless utility role made Torkoal valuable in doubles and VGC formats where weather control mattered enormously, and Torkoal's bulk let it survive, to set sun multiple times through rapid spin or switching. The turtle basis suggested slow, deliberate movement and patient setup, characteristics that translated into low-speed stat and defensive move pool focused on hazards and status rather than direct damage. Shell Smash gave Torkoal option to become Sweeper, sacrificing defenses to boost offensive stats and speed, transformation from Defensive Wall to Glass Cannon that required specific team support to execute successfully. White Herb negated defensive drops from Shell Smash, effectively giving Torkoal free boosts to attack, special attack, and speed while maintaining defensive stats for one turn, setup turn, that could snowball into sweep if opponent lacked priority or couldn't respond quickly enough. This versatility between defensive and offensive sets made Torkoal unpredictable, opponents unsure whether they faced support Pokemon or potential sweeper, mind games emerging from single Pokemon filling multiple possible roles. The smoke that continuously pours from Torkoal's shell created visual identities separate from flames, suggesting incomplete combustion or coal burning without adequate oxygen, internal fires producing smoke because they couldn't burn cleanly. This aesthetic detail reinforced Torkoal's defensive nature, fires banked and controlled rather than raging freely, heat maintained for endurance rather than brief explosive power. The animation of Torkoal pulling into shell and continuing to smoke while protected demonstrated commitment to defensive identity, creature that responded to threat by hiding rather than attacking, relying on passive deterrence rather than active aggression. Darumaka and Darmanitan brought bipolar design philosophy to fire types, Zen mode ability, allowing Darmanitan to transform from physical attacker to special tank when health dropped below half, complete role reversal mid-battle that required opponents adapt strategies on the fly. Standard mode. Darmanitan boasted massive attack stat and access to Flare Blitz and Superpower, pure offensive threat that aimed to eliminate opponents before they could strike back. Zen mode reduced attack while increasing defenses, and special attack, transforming Darmanitan into bulky special attacker that could take hits and retaliate with special fire and psychic moves, polar opposite of its standard form's Berserker approach. Galarian Darmanitan maintained the split personality but added ice typing and guerrilla tactics ability in standard mode, locking it into single move while boosting attack to absurd levels, choice item effect, without needing to hold choice item. This created devastatingly powerful physical attacker that could plow through teams with Icicle Crash and Flare Blitz, but struggled when opponents switched to resists because guerrilla tactics prevented move changes without switching out and back in. Zen mode still triggered below half health, but Galarian Zen mode was Ice Fire, with different stat spread and defensive focus, completely different Pokemon that emerged when health fell below threshold. The fire typing in Galarian Darmanitan's Zen mode felt unusual given standard mode, being pure ice, typing transformation, suggesting fire emerged only when Darmanitan meditated and accessed deeper power reserves normally kept hidden. This implied fire as the inner element, spiritual heat contrasting with external ice, personality made elemental through typing that reflected the mental state rather than physical biology. The mechanic failed competitively because losing half health often meant losing the battle, transformation trigger requiring Darmanitan take damage that frequently killed it outright or left it too weak to capitalize on Zen mode's different capabilities. Heatmore appeared as specialist predator designed specifically to hunt and eat Durant, fire type whose entire biology revolved around defeating steel bug ants that would otherwise resist normal fire attacks. The claws were shaped to dig into Durant colonies, Long Tongue reached into ant tunnels to extract prey, and the internal flames burned hot enough to melt Durant's metallic carapaces. This predator-prey relationship created ecological niche where fire type evolved specifically to counter typing that normally walled it, natural selection producing solution to environmental challenge through specialized adaptation. The design drew from anteaters, long snout and tongue, combined with fire breathing, creating creature that felt realistic, despite fantasy elements. Competitively, Heatmore remained largely irrelevant, stats too mediocre, and move pool too limited for serious tournament use, but thematically it succeeded as example of fire-type filling specific role in ecosystem rather than being generalist powerhouse. The Pokédex entries emphasizing its Durant hunting behavior created depth, suggesting Pokémon World had food chains and ecological relationships beyond just trainer battles, wild Pokémon pursuing survival rather than glory or friendship. This naturalistic world building made regions feel more alive, fire types existing for reasons beyond serving trainers, having purposes and drives that predated human involvement and would continue after human civilization ended. Flareon holds distinction of being least competitively viable. Evolution, for most of franchise history, amazing special attack stat wasted on move pool that heavily favored physical attacks before physical special split, trapped with Fire Blast as only special fire stab, while its high attack stat had no physical fire moves to capitalize on. Flare Blitz's addition fixed this somewhat, giving Flareon physical fire stab that benefited from attack stat, but recoil damage combined with low speed and poor defensive typing meant Flareon usually fainted quickly after using it. The design as Fluffy Fire Dog remained beloved despite competitive struggles, aesthetic appeal carrying it through decades of mechanical inadequacy. Flashy fire ability provided some utility, absorbing fire attacks and boosting Flareon's own fire moves, making it potential counter to Sun teams or fire-type spam, but this niche remained too narrow to justify team slot in most circumstances. Guts' ability with Toxic Orb turned Flareon into status-immune physical attacker with boosted attack, strategy that worked against specific opponents but folded immediately to anything faster or resistant to fire attacks. The various attempts to make Flareon viable demonstrated designer commitment to fixing early mistakes, continuing to support Pokémon that probably should have been left behind or reworked completely. The lore describing Flareon's body temperature reaching 1600 degrees Celsius explained how it could survive with flame sac inside its body, internal heat high enough that normal biological processes should fail, but Flareon endured through unknown mechanisms. This biological impossibility extended across most fire types, creatures whose internal temperatures exceeded melting points of the proteins and materials that composed their bodies, physics. Defying existence hand-waved through its fantasy without attempting scientific explanation. Players accepted this because demanding realism from games about electric mice and psychic spoons felt absurd, suspension of disbelief fundamental to engaging with Pokémon at all. Volcanion embodied steam power through fire-water typing that let it superheat water instantly and release pressurized steam as devastating attacks. The steam control made Volcanion useful for both offense and mobility, jet propulsion through steam venting, allowing it to fly despite lacking wings or other flight mechanisms. Steam Eruption's signature move dealt fire damage with 30% burn chance, scalding water made weapon through volcanic heat, combination of types creating attacks neither could produce independently. The design referenced Industrial Revolution machinery, pipes and vents, incorporated into organic form, creature that was simultaneously living being and walking factory. The mythical status meant Volcanion remained event exclusive, distributed only during limited windows through special promotions, keeping it rare and maintaining mystique around steam-based fire-water Pokémon that shouldn't biologically exist. The defensive typing granted single weakness to ground while resisting 6 types including steel, fairy, fire, and ice, amazing defensive profile that would have made Volcanion over-centralizing if more accessible. This balance between rarity and power characterized mythical Pokémon generally, strong enough to justify special status, but limited enough in distribution to prevent metagame warping. The lore positioned Volcanion as a protector of natural habitats, specifically defending areas where geothermal activity created unique ecosystems reliant on volcanic heat. This environmental guardian role elevated Volcanion beyond just being powerful firewater Pokémon into having purpose and motivation, creature that used its strength to protect rather than conquer. The mythology added weight to catching it, player claiming being whose responsibilities included maintaining entire ecosystems, reducing guardian deity to combat tool without addressing ethical implications of capturing something needed for environmental stability. Turtonator's shell trap returns to consideration through lens of how fire types create defensive options from naturally offensive typing, converting heat into protection by threatening retaliation rather than preventing damage directly. The mechanic forced opponents into difficult choices, attacking and risking shell trap's massive damage, or waiting and giving Turtonator free turn to set up again, psychological pressure that sometimes proved more valuable than actual execution. This mind game element made Turtonator interesting despite mediocre stats, opponents' fear of shell trap sometimes more threatening than shell trap itself, presence alone influencing decisions. The Dragonfire typing suggested ancient power, primordial force that predated current age, Turtonator as survivor from time when dragons ruled and fire meant dominion rather than just combat element. The shell explosive design referenced naval mines and volcanic vents simultaneously, human warfare and natural geological processes combined into single defensive mechanism. This duality between technological and natural solutions appeared throughout fire-type design, some Pokémon using biological heat, while others employed chemical or mechanical combustion, different paths to same result of producing flames. Thanks for watching. If you felt calm wandering through these soft moments, there's another video on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you settle in. It might guide you into an even deeper rest.